My daughter told everyone I had dementia so she could drain my bank account. I played along for months, pretending to forget everything. But when the police knocked on her door with handcuffs in hand, she finally understood what I'd been doing all that time. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Let me tell you about Margaret Chen, a woman whose kindness became her greatest vulnerability. At 68 years old, Margaret was the kind of person who made the world softer just by existing in it. For 40 years, she worked as a school librarian in a small suburban town outside Seattle, helping thousands of children discover that books could be windows to other worlds. She remembered every child's name, every favorite story, every shy smile when a reluctant reader finally found the book that changed everything. Margaret's life had been built on sacrifice, though she never called it that. When her husband David was diagnosed with cancer 12 years ago, she worked double shifts while caring for him at night, never complaining, never asking for help. She held his hand through every chemotherapy session and read to him from his favorite novels when the pain kept him awake. David passed away 3 years ago, leaving Margaret alone in the house they'd built together, surrounded by memories and a modest but secure financial legacy from his life insurance and their combined retirement savings. But Margaret wasn't truly alone. She had her daughter, Rebecca, her only child, the little girl she'd rocked to sleep every night, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose dreams she'd funded even when it meant sacrificing her own. When Rebecca wanted to go to law school, Margaret sold the lake house she and David had bought for their retirement. "Your education is more important than my vacation," she'd told Rebecca with a smile. When Rebecca got married, Margaret paid for half the wedding, draining her savings account without hesitation. When Rebecca had a daughter, little Emma, Margaret became the devoted grandmother who babysat every weekend, who never said no, who poured all her leftover love into this new generation. Margaret's home reflected who she was. Every surface held a memory. Photo albums stacked neatly on shelves, each picture a testament to a life spent loving others. Handmade quilts draped over furniture, stitched during long evenings after David died when the silence became too heavy. The kitchen still smelled like the cinnamon rolls she baked every Sunday morning before Rebecca, Tom, and Emma arrived for family dinner. Her garden bloomed with roses David had planted years ago, which she tended carefully, talking to him as she pruned and watered. Financially, Margaret was comfortable, not wealthy, but secure. Her pension from 40 years of teaching, combined with David's life insurance payout and their modest investment portfolio, meant she had roughly $500,000 in assets. She lived simply, spending money on books for the library donations, gifts for Emma, and occasional treats for herself. She'd planned carefully, wanting to leave a generous inheritance to Rebecca and Emma, to give them the security she and David had worked so hard to build. Margaret believed in family above everything else. She believed that the bonds between mother and daughter were unbreakable, that blood meant loyalty, that the love she'd poured into Rebecca for 42 years would be returned when she needed it most. She believed that growing old meant being surrounded by the people you'd sacrificed everything to raise. She had no idea that these beliefs, this trust, this unconditional love, were about to become the weapons her own daughter would use to destroy her. Before everything fell apart, Margaret's life followed a rhythm as comforting and predictable as a favorite song. Each morning she woke at exactly 6:30, just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains David had hung in their bedroom 20 years ago. She'd slip into her soft cotton robe, the blue one Emma had picked out for her last birthday, and pad downstairs to the kitchen where everything waited in its proper place. By 7 o'clock, the kettle would be whistling, and Margaret would brew her jasmine tea in the delicate porcelain cup that had belonged to her mother. She'd stand at the kitchen window, cradling the warm cup in both hands, watching the birds gather at the feeder she filled every evening. Chickadees, finches, and the occasional bold blue jay. David used to joke that she knew each bird by name. Maybe she did. There was something peaceful about these small, faithful creatures returning every morning, trusting that she'd be there for them. Tuesdays and Thursdays were her volunteer days at the Riverside Community Library. Margaret would arrive by 9, greeting the staff who'd become like family over the years. She organized book drives for underprivileged schools, reading programs for struggling students, and donation sorting that kept the library stocked with fresh titles. The head librarian, Patricia Chen, no relation despite the shared last name, often said the library would collapse without Margaret's steady hands and generous heart. Margaret would laugh it off, but the work gave her purpose, made her feel useful in a world that often discarded its elderly as irrelevant. Wednesdays were for her garden. She'd spend hours among David's roses, pulling weeds, deadheading spent blooms, talking to him as if he were still sitting on the porch with his coffee and newspaper. "The pink ones are doing beautifully this year," she'd say to the empty air. "Remember how you said they'd never survive that harsh winter? You were wrong, my love." Sometimes neighbors would hear her talking and smile sympathetically, assuming she was just a lonely old woman losing touch with reality. But Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. Talking to David kept him alive in the only way she had left. Sundays were sacred. Every Sunday without fail, Rebecca would arrive around noon with Tom and Emma. Margaret would spend the entire morning preparing, cooking Rebecca's favorite pot roast with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes, the same recipe she'd made for every birthday and celebration since Rebecca was 5 years old. She'd set the dining table with her grandmother's fine china, the pieces painted with delicate blue flowers that had survived 3 generations. Fresh-cut roses from the garden would sit in a crystal vase at the center. When they arrived, the house would fill with life again. Emma would run to hug her, showing off drawings from school or a new book she was reading. Rebecca would kiss Margaret's cheek and compliment the food. Tom would settle into David's old chair and discuss work or sports. For those few hours, Margaret felt complete. Her family gathered around her table, eating food she'd made with love, filling the rooms that had been too quiet, too empty during the long weeks between visits. After they left, Margaret would wash the dishes by hand, even though she had a perfectly good dishwasher, because the ritual soothed her. She'd dry each plate carefully and return it to its place, already planning next Sunday's menu. This was her life, simple, predictable, and filled with small moments of purpose and connection. She had everything she needed. She was content. She had no idea that this peaceful routine was already being studied, documented, and weaponized against her. The first crack in Margaret's peaceful world appeared on a Thursday afternoon in late September. She'd just returned from her volunteer shift at the library, her canvas tote bag still filled with books she'd borrowed for Emma, when her cell phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number with her bank's area code. Margaret answered, expecting perhaps a courtesy call about a new service or security feature. "Mrs. Chen, this is David Martinez from First National Bank's Fraud Prevention Department," the voice on the other end said professionally. "We're calling to verify some unusual activity on your checking account ending in 7342. Do you have a moment?" Margaret's stomach tightened slightly, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes, of course. What kind of activity?" "We show 3 large transfers made from your account over the past 2 weeks. The first was on September 8th for $6,000, another on September 12th for $5,500, and a third yesterday for $7,200. All 3 went to an account registered under the name Rebecca Chen. These transfers are outside your normal spending patterns, so we wanted to confirm you authorized them." Margaret stood frozen in her kitchen, one hand gripping the phone, the other pressed against the cool countertop for support. $18,700, nearly $19,000 transferred to Rebecca's account. She tried to remember, searching her memory for any conversation about money, any request for help, any emergency Rebecca might have mentioned. Nothing came. "Mrs. Chen, are you still there?" the banker asked. "Yes, I'm here. I'm trying to remember." Her voice sounded thin, uncertain even to her own ears. "Can you tell me when exactly these transfers were made? What time of day?" "Certainly. The first was at 2:15 p.m. on the 8th, the second at 11:30 a.m. on the 12th, and the third at 3:40 p.m. yesterday. All were initiated through online banking using your login credentials." Margaret's mind raced. September 8th. That was a Sunday. Rebecca, Tom, and Emma had been here for dinner, while Margaret had been in the garden cutting fresh flowers for the table. Rebecca had gone upstairs, saying she needed to use the bathroom. She'd been gone for nearly 20 minutes. Margaret remembered because the potatoes had started boiling over and she'd had to rush inside. September 12th. That was unusual because Rebecca had stopped by on a Wednesday, not her normal visiting day. She'd brought lunch, insisting Margaret rest while she tidied up the office, where Margaret's computer sat on the old oak desk. Margaret had thought it was sweet, thoughtful even. Yesterday, Wednesday again. Another unexpected visit, another offer to help organize while Margaret rested. "Mrs. Chen?" the banker prompted again, concern creeping into his professional tone. Margaret made a decision in that split second. "Oh, yes," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I remember now. My daughter is helping me with some financial planning. I must have forgotten to mention it to you. Everything's fine." "Are you certain? If there's any doubt—" "No doubt at all. Thank you for checking, though. It's good to know you're watching out for me." After she hung up, Margaret stood in her kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. $18,700. She hadn't authorized those transfers. She knew she hadn't. But Rebecca was her daughter, her only child. There had to be an explanation. That evening, Margaret called Rebecca. Her daughter answered on the third ring, voice cheerful and warm. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" "Sweetheart, the bank called today about some transfers to your account. They said it was almost $19,000 over the past couple weeks." Margaret tried to keep her voice light, non-accusatory, just curious. "Oh, Mom," Rebecca laughed gently. That patient laugh adults use with confused children. "Don't you remember? We talked about this. You asked me to help you set up automatic payments for your new supplemental insurance plan. You were worried about forgetting to pay it each month, so we set up the transfers to my account and I handle the payments for you. We discussed this 3 times. Margaret frowned. "I don't remember any new insurance." "That's exactly why we set it up this way, Mom. You've been forgetting things lately. It's okay. That's what I'm here for." Rebecca's voice dripped with concern, with love, with patience. Margaret wanted to argue. She wanted to say she hadn't forgotten, that there was no insurance plan, that something felt wrong. But doubt crept in like cold fog. She was 68 years old. Her friend Joyce from the library had started forgetting appointments last year. Another friend, Helen, sometimes couldn't remember what she'd eaten for breakfast. Was this what aging meant? Losing pieces of yourself so gradually you didn't notice until someone else pointed it out? "Oh," Margaret said softly. "I'm sorry. I must have forgotten." "Don't apologize, Mom. That's why I'm here, to help you." Rebecca's voice was honey-sweet. "Listen, why don't Tom and I come over this Sunday? I'll bring all the insurance paperwork and we can review it together, okay? Would that make you feel better?" "Yes, that would be nice." After they hung up, Margaret sat at her kitchen table as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. She wanted to believe Rebecca. She needed to believe Rebecca. The alternative, that her daughter might be lying, was too painful to consider. Margaret had spent 42 years raising that girl, sacrificing everything for her happiness. Rebecca wouldn't steal from her. Rebecca loved her. But that tiny seed of doubt, planted by the banker's phone call, had taken root somewhere deep in Margaret's chest. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she could feel it growing. Over the following weeks, Margaret worked overtime, convincing herself that everything was fine. She threw herself into her normal routines with almost desperate energy, as if staying busy would silence the nagging voice in the back of her mind that whispered something was wrong. She volunteered extra hours at the library, reorganized her entire kitchen, and spent long afternoons in the garden until her hands were stained with soil and her back ached. When she couldn't find her checkbook in early October, Margaret tore through every drawer in her office, every pocket of every purse, every shelf in her bedroom. It had been sitting in the desk drawer for 20 years, always in the same spot. Now it was simply gone. She stood in the middle of her office, hands trembling slightly, trying to remember the last time she'd seen it. Had she moved it somewhere unusual? Had she thrown it away by accident while cleaning? "You're just getting older," she told herself firmly, speaking aloud to the empty room. "People misplace things. This is normal." But it wasn't just the checkbook. Small things kept disappearing or moving. Her reading glasses turned up in the refrigerator one morning, nestled between the milk and orange juice. Margaret stared at them for a full minute, trying desperately to remember putting them there. She couldn't. Her spare house key vanished from the hook by the door. Important papers she kept filed alphabetically seemed to shift positions, as if someone had looked through them and put them back wrong. Each incident chipped away at her confidence, making her question her own mind. Rebecca's visits became more frequent, which Margaret told herself was a blessing. Her daughter would drop by on random afternoons, always with a warm smile and a compelling reason. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you. I brought you some groceries. I know how you hate driving in traffic. Let me help you organize your medicine cabinet. We want to make sure you're taking everything correctly." Tom started accompanying Rebecca to these visits, which struck Margaret as odd since he usually worked long hours. He'd sit in David's old chair, scrolling through his phone, occasionally looking up to ask Margaret questions that felt strangely specific. "Do you remember what you had for breakfast this morning, Margaret? What year did you retire again? Can you tell me today's date?" The questions made her feel like she was being tested, evaluated, judged. But when she mentioned it to Rebecca, her daughter simply laughed. "Tom's just being thorough, Mom. He works with elderly clients in his accounting firm, so he notices these things. He's trying to help." Rebecca would pat Margaret's hand, her touch gentle but somehow condescending. "You know, it might be easier if you let us handle some of the complicated stuff. Bills, bank statements, insurance forms. All that paperwork is so confusing these days. Even I get overwhelmed sometimes, and I'm a lawyer." Margaret wanted to protest. She'd managed household finances for 45 years. She'd balanced budgets, filed taxes, invested wisely, and never missed a single payment. But Rebecca made it sound so reasonable, so caring. And wasn't it normal for adult children to help their aging parents? Margaret's friend Dorothy had given her son power of attorney years ago. Patricia at the library let her daughter manage her investments. Maybe this was just what families did. "I'm fine handling my own affairs," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice firm but kind. "Of course you are, Mom," Rebecca replied, smiling in that patient way again. "We just want to be here for you. You took care of me my whole life. Let me take care of you now." The words sounded beautiful, loving even. But something about Rebecca's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Margaret noticed it, but immediately felt guilty for the observation. This was her daughter, her baby girl, the child she'd nursed through fevers and heartbreaks and every difficult moment of growing up. Rebecca loved her. Rebecca would never hurt her. So Margaret pushed down the doubt, buried it deep beneath layers of hope and desperate need to believe. She smiled back at Rebecca, accepted the help with grace, and told herself that everything was exactly as it should be. Families helped each other. Children cared for aging parents. This was natural. This was love. But late at night, lying alone in the bed she'd once shared with David, Margaret would stare at the ceiling and feel that seed of doubt growing larger, spreading roots through her chest, wrapping around her heart. And in those dark, honest moments, she couldn't quite convince herself any more that everything was fine. Still, when morning came, she'd push the feelings away and put on her smile. Denial was easier than facing the alternative, because the alternative meant accepting that the person she loved most in the world might be betraying her, and that truth was simply too painful to bear. The truth arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in late October, wrapped in silence and hidden beneath a stack of forgotten papers. Margaret had decided to tackle a project she'd been avoiding for months, organizing the cluttered home office that David had once kept immaculate. After his death, she'd let things pile up, unable to face the space that still smelled faintly of his cologne and coffee. She started with the desk drawers, pulling them open one by one, sorting through old receipts, expired coupons, rubber bands, and the miscellaneous debris that accumulates over years of living. The bottom right drawer stuck when she tried to open it, swollen from humidity or misaligned from age. Margaret tugged harder, and it finally gave way with a sharp scrape. Inside, wedged at the back behind a stack of old greeting cards, she found a pile of envelopes, bank statements. They were addressed to her, but she didn't remember opening them or putting them in this drawer. Her name and address showed clearly through the plastic windows, and the dates ranged from June through September. 4 months of statements she'd never seen. Margaret's hands trembled as she carried them to the kitchen table, where the afternoon light was strongest. She needed her reading glasses. It took her 3 tries to find them, her heart already racing, her breath coming shallow and quick. Finally, she sat down, spread the statements across the table like evidence at a crime scene, and began to read. The first statement, dated June, showed a $5,000 transfer on June 15th. Destination account? Rebecca Chen. Margaret stared at the line item, her mind struggling to process the information. She flipped to July, 2 transfers, one for $6,000 on July 3rd, another for $5,500 on July 22nd. August showed 3 transfers, each between $4,000 and $7,000. September had 4, including the ones the bank had called about. Margaret's vision blurred as she pulled out her calculator with shaking fingers. She added the numbers once, then again to make sure, then a third time because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Over 4 months, $43,700 had been transferred from her accounts to Rebecca's. Not the $18,000 the bank had mentioned, $43,000. She checked the dates against her wall calendar, the one where she marked every appointment and visit in her neat handwriting. A pattern emerged that made her stomach turn. Almost every transfer corresponded with a day Rebecca had visited. June 15th, Rebecca had come for Sunday dinner and insisted Margaret take a nap after lunch because she looked tired. July 3rd was the day Rebecca brought lunch on a Wednesday, the first unusual midweek visit. July 22nd, another Sunday when Rebecca had volunteered to organize the office while Margaret watered the garden. Margaret's mind replayed every visit with horrible new clarity. Rebecca always found reasons for Margaret to leave the room. "Go rest, Mom. I'll clean up the kitchen." "Why don't you take a nice bath? You deserve to relax." "Sit in the garden for a bit. I'll handle the dishes." And during those absences, while Margaret obediently rested or relaxed or busied herself elsewhere, Rebecca had been in this office, at this desk, using the computer to transfer thousands of dollars into her own account. The new insurance plan was a lie. There was no insurance. There had never been any insurance. Margaret sat frozen at her kitchen table as the autumn sun moved across the floor, casting long shadows that slowly swallowed the room. The house was absolutely silent except for the ticking of David's old clock on the mantel and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She felt like she was drowning, like the walls were closing in, like the air had turned to water, and she couldn't quite figure out how to breathe anymore. Her daughter was stealing from her, not borrowing, not helping, stealing. The word felt obscene, impossible. This was Rebecca, her baby, the little girl she'd rocked to sleep singing lullabies. The teenager she'd stayed up with during heartbreaks and exam stress. The woman she'd sacrificed everything for, again and again, without hesitation or resentment. Margaret's hands moved on autopilot, gathering the statements, folding them carefully, and hiding them in a place Rebecca would never think to look, beneath the mattress in the guest bedroom that no one ever used. She couldn't leave them out. She couldn't let Rebecca know she'd found them. Not yet. Not until she understood what was really happening. Because $43,000 wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, and systematic. And if Rebecca was capable of this, what else was she capable of? What was the end game? How far did this betrayal go? Margaret returned to the kitchen and sat in the growing darkness, too stunned to turn on the lights, too heartbroken to cry. The woman who'd spent 68 years believing in the goodness of family, in the unbreakable bond between mother and child, felt that belief shatter into pieces too small to ever put back together. The full, devastating truth crashed down on Margaret the following Sunday, and it came dressed in professional clothing and false concern. Rebecca arrived at noon as usual, but this time Tom accompanied her. And with them was a woman Margaret had never seen before. She was perhaps 50, dressed in a navy business suit, carrying a leather portfolio that screamed authority and importance. Margaret opened the door, confusion already tightening her chest. "Rebecca? I thought it was just going to be us today. Where's Emma?" "She's at Tom's mother's house, Mom." Rebecca swept inside, kissing Margaret's cheek with the same warmth she always displayed. "We need to talk about something important, so we thought it would be better without distractions. This is Patricia Hendricks from Elder Care Services." The woman extended her hand, her smile professional and practiced. "Mrs. Chen, it's so nice to meet you. Your daughter has told me wonderful things about you." Margaret shook her hand automatically, her mind racing. Elder Care Services? Why would Rebecca bring someone from Elder Care Services without warning her first? "I don't understand. What's this about?" They settled in the living room, Margaret perched on the edge of David's old recliner, feeling ambushed in her own home. Patricia opened her portfolio with efficient movements, pulling out documents that looked official and intimidating. Rebecca sat beside her on the sofa, her face arranged in an expression of loving concern that Margaret now recognized as performance. "Mrs. Chen," Patricia began gently, "your daughter contacted our agency 3 weeks ago because she's been very worried about you. She's noticed some concerning changes in your behavior and cognitive function over the past several months." Margaret's blood went cold. "What changes?" Rebecca leaned forward, reaching for Margaret's hand. Margaret let her take it, feeling the touch like ice against her skin. "Mom, please don't be upset. We're only trying to help, but you've been so forgetful lately. You call me by the wrong name sometimes. You can't remember conversations we've had. You put your glasses in the refrigerator. You asked me the same question 4 times in one afternoon last week." "I did?" Margaret's voice came out small, uncertain, even as her mind screamed that this was wrong, that she remembered everything perfectly. Patricia consulted her notes. "According to Rebecca's documentation, you've experienced multiple incidents of confusion, memory loss, and difficulty managing daily tasks. You've forgotten to pay bills, misplaced important items, and shown disorientation about dates and appointments. Rebecca has kept detailed records." She slid a stack of papers across the coffee table toward Margaret. Margaret's hands shook as she picked them up. Page after page of typed notes, dated entries going back 6 months. "June 10th, Mom couldn't remember our lunch date. Called me 3 hours after our scheduled time asking where I was. June 18th, found her staring at the checkbook, confused about how to write a check. July 2nd, Mom insisted I never told her about Emma's dance recital, became agitated when I showed her the text messages. July 15th, noticed Mom wearing 2 different shoes to church." None of it was true. Margaret remembered June 10th perfectly. She'd been at the library all morning, and Rebecca had never confirmed the lunch. She'd never been confused about writing a check. She'd never worn mismatched shoes. But here it was, documented in black and white, a false history of her supposed decline written by her own daughter. "This isn't real," Margaret whispered. "None of this happened." Rebecca squeezed her hand tighter, her voice dripping with patient sympathy. "Mom, this is exactly what we're talking about. You don't remember these things because you're struggling, and that's okay. That's why we're here." Tom spoke for the first time, his voice flat and businesslike. "Margaret, the reality is that you can no longer safely manage your own affairs. Your confusion about finances has become particularly concerning." Patricia nodded, pulling out more documents. "We think it's time to discuss some options. Assisted living facilities where you'd have support and supervision. And perhaps, more importantly, we need to establish a power of attorney arrangement so Rebecca can manage your finances and medical decisions. It's for your own protection." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Assisted living. Power of attorney. They weren't here to help her. They were here to take control, to strip her of her independence, her home, her autonomy, to finish what the theft had started. Margaret looked at Rebecca, really looked at her, searching her daughter's face for some glimmer of the girl she'd raised. Instead, she saw cold calculation behind the mask of concern. She saw someone who'd spent months building a false narrative, creating fake evidence, constructing an elaborate lie to justify stealing everything Margaret had. "Why?" The word came out barely audible, broken. "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca's expression didn't change. She squeezed Margaret's hand again, her touch now feeling predatory rather than comforting. "Because you can't take care of yourself anymore, Mom. You're confused, forgetful, and making dangerous financial decisions. Someone needs to protect you from yourself. Someone needs to make sure you're safe and cared for." The words sounded so reasonable, so loving. But Margaret heard the truth beneath them. Someone needs to control your money. Someone needs access to your accounts. Someone needs to sell your house and take everything you've worked your entire life to build. Margaret pulled her hand away from Rebecca's grasp. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady despite the tears burning behind her eyes. "I want you to leave, all of you. Now." Patricia began gathering her papers with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to emotional family moments. Tom stood immediately, already heading for the door. But Rebecca stayed seated, her mask of concern slipping just slightly to reveal something harder, more determined underneath. "Mom, you're upset. I understand. But this conversation isn't over. We're going to help you whether you think you need it or not. Because that's what family does." After they left, Margaret locked the door and leaned against it, her legs finally giving out as she slid to the floor. The magnitude of the betrayal crashed over her in waves. This wasn't just about money. Rebecca had been building a case against her, creating a fictional version of Margaret as incompetent and confused, preparing to have her declared mentally unfit so she could seize control of everything. And the most terrifying part? It was working. Patricia had believed every word. Tom had believed it. How many other people had Rebecca already convinced that Margaret was losing her mind? Margaret sat on the floor of her entryway, in the house she'd called home for 30 years, and understood with perfect, horrible clarity that her daughter had declared war. And she'd been losing it without even knowing a battle had begun. For 3 days after Patricia's visit, Margaret barely slept. She lay awake in the darkness, her mind turning over every interaction, every visit, every seemingly innocent moment with Rebecca over the past 6 months. What she'd dismissed as paranoia now revealed itself as methodical planning. This wasn't impulse or desperation. This was strategy. On the 4th day, Margaret began her own investigation. She started with her computer, checking her browsing history, something she'd never thought to do before. What she found made her blood run cold. Someone had been accessing websites she'd never visited, elder care facilities in the surrounding counties, legal forms for power of attorney, websites explaining how to petition for guardianship of an incapacitated adult. The searches had been done from her computer using her internet connection, but she hadn't made them. Rebecca had, during all those helpful visits when she'd organized the office. Margaret printed everything, her hands shaking as page after page emerged from the printer, evidence of premeditation, proof that this had been planned far in advance. Next, she called her bank and requested copies of all transactions for the past year, not just the statements she'd found. When the documents arrived 2 days later, Margaret spread them across her dining table and traced the pattern. The theft hadn't started in June. It had started in February 11 months ago with small amounts, $200 here, $500 there, amounts small enough that Margaret wouldn't notice in her monthly balance. The transfers had grown gradually larger, testing to see if she was paying attention. By June, Rebecca had become bold enough to take thousands at a time. Total amount stolen, $68,400. Margaret felt sick, but she forced herself to keep digging. She contacted her doctor's office, requesting copies of her medical records. What arrived shocked her. 3 appointments she'd never made, scheduled on days she'd been volunteering at the library. Notes in her file from Dr. Patterson describing concerns about patient's cognitive function reported by daughter Rebecca Chen. One note mentioned that Rebecca had called the office specifically to report her mother's increasing confusion and memory problems. But Margaret had seen Dr. Patterson for her annual physical just 3 months ago. He'd given her a clean bill of health, praised her mental sharpness, and joked that she was healthier than patients half her age. How had these other notes gotten into her file? She called the office. The receptionist, Sarah, who'd known Margaret for 15 years, explained apologetically. Rebecca called several times expressing concern about you, Mrs. Chen. She asked Dr. Patterson to make notes about potential early-stage dementia symptoms she'd observed. He added them to your file as family-reported observations. She seemed so worried about you. Margaret thanked her and hung up, her hands clenched into fists. Rebecca had been poisoning her medical records, creating a paper trail of cognitive decline that didn't exist. If this ever went to court, if Rebecca ever petitioned for guardianship, these records would support her case. The conspiracy went deeper still. Margaret began calling her friends, casual conversations that revealed disturbing patterns. Her friend Joyce from the library mentioned that Rebecca had stopped by the library twice in recent months. She was asking about you, dear, wanted to know if we'd noticed any changes in your behavior, any forgetfulness. She seemed so concerned. We told her you were sharp as ever, but she looked skeptical. Helen from church reported a similar visit. Your daughter came to my house in September. She showed me some kind of checklist about dementia symptoms and asked if I'd noticed any of them in you. I told her absolutely not, that you were the same Margaret you'd always been. She seemed almost disappointed by my answer. Margaret felt her world tilting. Rebecca hadn't just been building a case within the family. She'd been canvassing Margaret's entire social circle, planting seeds of doubt, trying to find people who would confirm her narrative. When friends insisted Margaret was fine, Rebecca had simply moved on, searching for someone who might agree with her invented story. Then Margaret made the discovery that changed everything. While going through old papers in the attic searching for anything Rebecca might have touched, she found a folder tucked behind Christmas decorations. Inside were documents related to Margaret's house, the deed, the property assessment, and stapled to them, printouts from real estate websites showing comparable home values in the neighborhood. Her house was worth $420,000. Attached was a business card for a luxury real estate agent with a handwritten note. Rebecca, great meeting you last week. As discussed, I can have your mother's property listed within 48 hours of obtaining authority. Based on current market conditions, expect offers within 2 weeks. Call me when you're ready to move forward. The date on the note was September 12th. Rebecca had been planning to sell Margaret's home, the house David built, the house where Margaret had raised her daughter, celebrated holidays, mourned her husband, and built a lifetime of memories. Rebecca was going to take it, sell it, and pocket the money. But there was more in the folder. Brochures for assisted living facilities, not the nice ones with gardens and activities. These were budget facilities, the kind with shared rooms and minimal care. Monthly costs ranging from $1,800 to $2,500. The cheapest options available. Margaret did the math with growing horror. The house was worth over $400,000. Her remaining bank accounts and investments totaled roughly another $400,000 after the theft, nearly $800,000 in total assets. If Rebecca gained control, she could sell everything, warehouse Margaret in a cheap facility for perhaps $2,000 a month, and keep the rest. Even if Margaret lived another 20 years, which would cost roughly $500,000 in care, Rebecca would walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars. This wasn't just theft. It was a complete financial takeover disguised as concerned caregiving. Rebecca and Tom had planned to strip Margaret of everything, isolate her in the cheapest facility they could find, and live off the proceeds of her life's work. The cruelty of it took Margaret's breath away. This was her daughter, the child she'd sacrificed everything for. And Rebecca was prepared to stuff her in an institutional room, take her home, drain her accounts, and visit maybe once a month with manufactured concern and empty promises. Margaret sat in her attic, surrounded by boxes of Christmas ornaments and family memories, holding evidence of her daughter's monstrous betrayal. The woman she'd raised had disappeared, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone motivated purely by greed, willing to destroy her own mother for money. But as Margaret sat there, something shifted inside her. The shock began to harden into something else, something cold and focused. Rebecca thought she'd won. She thought Margaret was a confused old woman too weak to fight back. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. Retrief. That night, Margaret didn't make dinner. She didn't turn on the lights as darkness fell. She simply sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed Rebecca as a baby, helped her with homework, celebrated her law school acceptance, and planned her wedding. The documents and evidence lay spread before her like the remains of something precious that had been shattered beyond repair. Around 8 o'clock, something inside Margaret broke. The dam she'd been holding back for weeks finally collapsed, and she wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place so raw, she didn't know she had the capacity for such pain. She cried until her ribs ached, until her throat burned, until she had nothing left. Memories assaulted her in waves. Rebecca, at 5 years old, running into her arms after the first day of kindergarten, talking excitedly about new friends and finger painting. "You're the best mommy in the whole world," she'd said, sticky hands cupping Margaret's face. Where had that little girl gone? When had she disappeared? Rebecca, at 16, sobbing over her first heartbreak, head in Margaret's lap, while Margaret stroked her hair and promised that love would come again. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom. You always know how to make everything better." The trust in her daughter's eyes that night had been absolute, sacred. Rebecca, at 22, graduating law school, hugging Margaret so tight she could barely breathe. "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom. The lake house, all your sacrifices, everything you gave up for me. I'll make you proud. I promise I'll make it all worth it." But she hadn't. She'd taken those sacrifices and twisted them into entitlement. She'd looked at everything Margaret had worked for and decided it belonged to her. Not someday, through inheritance, but now, immediately. Even if it meant destroying her own mother to get it. Margaret thought about David, wished desperately that he was here. He would know what to do. He would wrap his strong arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But David was gone, and she was alone, facing a betrayal he never could have imagined. Their daughter, the baby they'd loved so fiercely, had become someone neither of them would recognize. The worst part wasn't the money. Margaret could survive without the $68,000 Rebecca had already stolen. She could even survive losing the house if it came to that. The worst part was the deliberate cruelty of it. The manufactured dementia story, the fake medical records, the canvassing of friends and neighbors. Rebecca hadn't just stolen from her. She'd tried to erase her, to make the world believe Margaret was incompetent, confused, no longer worthy of respect or autonomy. Rebecca had tried to steal her identity, her dignity, her very self. Around midnight, Margaret finally lifted her head from the table. Her face was swollen, her eyes burned, and her body felt hollowed out. She looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. The woman looking back was a stranger, red-eyed and broken, someone who'd lost the thing she'd valued most in life, her faith in family. But as Margaret stared at that reflection, something flickered in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It was small at first, just a spark in the darkness, but it was growing. It was rage. Margaret woke the next morning on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her body stiff and aching. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented. Then the memories rushed back, and with them came a choice. She could crumble. She could let Rebecca win. She could sign whatever papers they put in front of her and accept the role of confused, declining old woman that her daughter had scripted for her. Or she could fight. Margaret rose slowly and walked to the bathroom. She stared at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her eyes were still swollen from crying, her hair disheveled, her face pale and drawn. She looked exactly like what Rebecca wanted her to be, a helpless, broken old woman, weak, vulnerable, easy to manipulate and control. But as Margaret stood there studying her reflection, something shifted in her expression. Her jaw tightened, her spine straightened, her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, hardened with determination. "No," she said aloud to the empty bathroom. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Absolutely not." She wasn't the helpless character Rebecca had invented. Margaret Chen had survived an abusive childhood that would have destroyed weaker people. She'd put herself through college, working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on ramen and determination. She'd raised a daughter mostly alone while David was deployed overseas, managing a household, a career, and a child's needs without complaint. She'd nursed her husband through terminal cancer, watching him waste away while maintaining her strength for both of them. She'd built a life from nothing, survived losses that would have shattered most people, and emerged intact every single time. She hadn't survived all of that to be destroyed by her own daughter. Rebecca had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She'd looked at her mother's kindness and mistaken it for weakness. She'd seen Margaret's gentle nature and assumed it meant she was passive, that she would simply accept whatever happened to her without resistance. She'd believed her own lies about dementia and confusion, convinced herself that Margaret was too old, too fragile, too diminished to see what was happening. But Margaret saw everything. She'd always seen everything. She simply hadn't wanted to believe it. Now that she did, now that she'd accepted the truth, she had clarity, purpose, and something Rebecca had never possessed: genuine intelligence honed by decades of real adversity. If Rebecca wanted to play games, Margaret would play. But she wouldn't play fair, and she wouldn't play by the rules Rebecca expected. She would be strategic, patient, and absolutely ruthless. She would use every advantage she had: her actual mental sharpness, Rebecca's overconfidence, and the element of complete surprise. Because Rebecca thought she'd already won. She thought Margaret was beaten, that it was just a matter of time before she secured the power of attorney and took control of everything. That arrogance would be her downfall. Margaret turned away from the mirror and walked to her bedroom. She made the bed with precise, careful movements, smoothing every wrinkle from the quilt. Then she showered, dressed in clean clothes, and pulled her hair back neatly. She made coffee, toasted bread, and ate breakfast at her kitchen table, while mentally cataloging everything she knew, everything she'd discovered, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. Then she picked up her phone and made the first call. Not to Rebecca, not to confront or accuse. That would be foolish, premature, exactly what an emotional, confused old woman would do. Instead, she called her dear friend, Linda Hartley, someone Rebecca had never met. Linda had retired from her law practice 5 years ago, but they'd remained close through the library volunteer program. Linda would know what to do. More importantly, Linda would believe her. "Linda," Margaret said when her friend answered, "I need your help. Can you come over today? It's urgent." By the time the sun set that evening, Margaret Chen had made her first move, and Rebecca had no idea the war had truly begun. Linda Hartley arrived within an hour, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her sharp lawyer's eyes already assessing the situation. Margaret led her to the kitchen table, now cleared of everything except the carefully organized folders of evidence. For 2 hours, she laid out everything: the stolen money, the fake medical records, the forged documents, the real estate agent's card, the budget-assisted living brochures, Rebecca's systematic campaign to convince everyone that Margaret was losing her mind. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When Margaret finished, Linda sat back and exhaled slowly. "This is elder financial abuse, Margaret. Criminal level. Rebecca could go to prison for this." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "But I don't think you want me to call the police right now, do you?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. If I confront her now, she'll just say I'm confused, that I'm proving her point about the dementia. She's spent months building this narrative. People are primed to believe her version over mine. So what do you want to do?" Margaret's eyes gleamed with cold determination. "I want to give her enough rope to hang herself. I want irrefutable evidence that she's competent enough to understand. I want to catch her in the act so thoroughly that she can't talk her way out. And I want her to think she's winning right up until the moment she loses everything." Linda smiled grimly. "You want to play along? Let her think the dementia story is working." "Exactly." Margaret leaned forward. "I need your help setting this up legally. Can you work with me without Rebecca knowing? Can you help me document everything in a way that will hold up in court?" Over the next 3 days, Margaret and Linda constructed the trap with surgical precision. Linda opened a new bank account under Margaret's name at a different institution, one Rebecca knew nothing about. Margaret transferred all her remaining funds there, every penny Rebecca hadn't already stolen. The old accounts were left with just enough to appear legitimate, but not enough to be worth taking. Linda helped Margaret install tiny security cameras in her office, virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. They were motion-activated and uploaded footage directly to a cloud account Rebecca couldn't access. Every time Rebecca entered that room, every keystroke on the computer, every document she touched would be recorded. Margaret bought a small digital recording device, barely larger than a USB drive, that she could keep in her pocket. Every conversation with Rebecca would now be documented. Linda checked Washington state's recording laws. Single-party consent, perfectly legal. They created a detailed log system. Every visit, every phone call, every interaction with Rebecca would be documented with dates, times, and detailed notes. Margaret would record Rebecca's lies and then immediately document the truth, creating a parallel record that would destroy her daughter's false narrative. Linda drafted legal documents confirming Margaret's mental competency, signed by her actual doctor after a thorough cognitive evaluation. Dr. Patterson was horrified when Margaret showed him the fake notes in her file and immediately wrote a detailed letter confirming she showed no signs of dementia or cognitive decline whatsoever. Most importantly, Margaret became an actress. She practiced in front of the mirror, perfecting the role of a woman slowly losing her grip on reality. She rehearsed forgetting names, repeating questions, looking confused at appropriate moments. She studied how to appear uncertain without overplaying it, how to seem just confused enough to be believable. "This is going to be hard," Linda warned, pretending to be something you're not while your own daughter steals from you. Margaret's expression was ice cold. "She thinks I'm weak. She thinks I'm a victim. I'm going to show her what a mistake that was." The performance of Margaret's life was about to begin. Over the next 3 months, Margaret delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. When Rebecca visited, which became increasingly frequent, Margaret played her role flawlessly. She forgot Rebecca's name once, calling her Ruth with convincing confusion. She asked what day it was multiple times during a single conversation. She left her coffee cup in the bathroom cabinet and seemed genuinely puzzled when Rebecca found it for her. Each calculated mistake made Rebecca's smile grow wider, more confident. The hidden cameras captured everything. Rebecca rifling through Margaret's files when she thought her mother was napping, Tom photographing bank documents with his phone, whispered conversations between them about just a few more weeks, and once we have the power of attorney. Every word, every action, permanently recorded. Margaret recorded their phone conversations too. Rebecca's voice, honey-sweet and patient, explaining things Margaret forgot that had never actually happened. "Mom, we talked about this yesterday, remember? You asked me to handle your bills because you were getting confused." Lies, all lies, now preserved forever in digital format. The log Linda helped her create grew thicker. Dates, times, verbatim quotes. Margaret's meticulous documentation painted a picture of systematic manipulation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. In early January, Rebecca accelerated her timeline. She started bringing Tom to every visit, both of them pressing harder. "Mom, you really need to let us help more. What if something happens to you? What if you fall and we can't access your accounts to pay for medical care?" The concern in Rebecca's voice was masterful, but Margaret saw through it now. It wasn't love. It was impatience, greed wearing a mask of caring. Then came the day Margaret had been waiting for. Rebecca called, her voice tight with barely suppressed excitement. "Mom, I need to come over on Sunday. It's really important. Tom and I have some papers we need you to look at, legal documents that will protect you." Margaret knew what those papers were. The power of attorney forms, the culmination of Rebecca's 6-month campaign, the moment her daughter planned to take legal control of everything Margaret owned. "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, perfectly uncertain. "Will Emma be there? I miss my grandbaby." "Not this time, Mom. This is adult business, just some simple forms. Nothing to worry about." After hanging up, Margaret called Linda. "It's happening. This Sunday." Linda's voice was grim. "Are you ready?" "More than ready." Margaret looked at the thick folder of evidence sitting on her desk. Months of documentation. Dozens of hours of video footage. Recorded conversations. Bank records. Everything she needed. "Make the call, Linda. Have them ready to move on Sunday afternoon." That Sunday morning, Margaret dressed carefully. A simple blue cardigan, soft gray slacks, her hair styled neatly but not too perfectly. She looked like exactly what Rebecca expected, a slightly confused elderly woman, still proper but beginning to fray at the edges. She made coffee with hands that didn't shake despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it, the end game. Months of planning, performing, and documenting, all coming to a head in a few hours. At 11:30, Rebecca's car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Margaret saw not just Rebecca and Tom, but Patricia Hendricks from Elder Care Services and a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. The lawyer. They'd brought the entire team for this final push. Margaret opened the door with a wavering smile. "Oh my, so many people. Come in, come in. I wasn't expecting such a crowd." Rebecca kissed her cheek. "It's fine, Mom. Everyone here wants to help you. We have those important papers to sign, remember? The ones I told you about?" Papers? Oh, yes, I think so. Margaret touched her temple as if confused. I'm sorry, dear. Sometimes things get muddled. That's exactly why we're here, Mrs. Chen, the lawyer said smoothly, his voice professionally sympathetic. To make sure you're protected. They settled in the living room, Tom beside Rebecca on the sofa, Patricia in the armchair, the lawyer across from Margaret, already opening his briefcase and pulling out documents. So many documents, all designed to strip Margaret of her autonomy, her control, her life. The lawyer began his presentation, explaining in carefully simplified language about power of attorney, about Rebecca's ability to make financial and medical decisions in your best interest, about how this was standard procedure for people in your situation. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, looking appropriately confused at the right moments. She watched Rebecca's face, saw the barely contained triumph in her daughter's eyes. Rebecca thought she'd won. After 6 months of manipulation and theft, she believed she was minutes away from complete victory. The lawyer slid the documents across the coffee table toward Margaret. If you'll just sign here, Mrs. Chen, and here and here. He pointed to signature lines with his expensive pen. Margaret picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, a nice touch she'd practiced. She held it over the first signature line, appearing to study the document even though she had no intention of reading it. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice gentle but eager. It's okay, Mom. Just sign. Trust me. I'm doing this because I love you. Margaret looked up at her daughter. For just a moment, she let the mask slip. Her eyes cleared completely, sharp and aware, and she saw Rebecca register the change with dawning confusion. Then came the sound that would change everything. 3 sharp knocks on the front door, heavy, authoritative, unmistakable. Everyone froze. Rebecca's face went pale. Who is that? Margaret set down the pen with absolute calm, her hand no longer trembling. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, strong, without a trace of confusion. That would be the police. I called them this morning. What? Rebecca's voice cracked. Mom, what are you talking about? Margaret stood and walked to the door. 2 officers stood on her porch, badges visible, expressions serious and professional. Officers, thank you for coming. Please, come in. Mrs. Margaret Chen? The lead officer asked. Yes, that's me. Margaret's voice was steady, authoritative. Nothing like the confused elderly woman who'd been sitting there moments before. The officers entered, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere. Tom half rose from his seat, then sank back down. Patricia clutched her portfolio like a shield. The lawyer's professional composure cracked. Rebecca simply stared at her mother, frozen. Rebecca Chen? The lead officer asked. Rebecca nodded mutely, unable to speak. We have a warrant for your arrest for elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Patricia stood abruptly. I had no idea. I was simply providing consultation services. I believed everything Rebecca told me. She was already backing toward the door. The lawyer moved even faster. I was hired under false pretenses. I have no involvement in any criminal activity. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and practically fled. Tom tried to follow, but the second officer blocked his path. Thomas Morrison? You're also named in the warrant. Rebecca finally found her voice. This is insane. Mom, what are you doing? You're confused. You don't understand what's happening. Margaret reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the small recording device. She set it on the coffee table with a decisive click. I understand perfectly, Rebecca. I've understood for months. I've been recording every conversation, every lie you told, every time you gaslit me about my memory, every time you coached me to sign something or told people I had dementia. She walked to her office and returned with a thick folder, placing it beside the recorder. I also have video footage. Security cameras you didn't know about, capturing you going through my files, accessing my computer, stealing my financial information. Every single time you came to this house pretending to care while you were actually robbing me. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed. But you were so confused. You forgot everything. You called me the wrong name. I'm a retired librarian, Rebecca. I managed complex budgets and cataloging systems for 40 years. Did you really think I couldn't remember where I put my reading glasses? Margaret's voice was ice cold. I was acting. And you were so confident, so certain I was helpless that you never questioned it. She pulled out bank statements. $68,400. That's how much you stole from me over 11 months. I have records of every transfer. The dates match your visits perfectly. Tom lurched forward. You can't prove we did anything wrong. She was helping you manage your finances. Margaret smiled, a terrible, humorless expression. I also have documentation of the forged medical records. The fake notes added to my file claiming I had dementia. The calls to my friends and neighbors trying to convince them I was losing my mind. She pulled out more papers. And I have this, the business card from the real estate agent you contacted about selling my house, the brochures for budget-assisted living facilities, your entire plan, documented in your own hand. Rebecca's face crumbled. Mom, please, you don't understand. Tom's business was failing. You needed money, so you decided to destroy your own mother to get it? Margaret's voice shook, not with confusion, but with fury. You tried to have me declared incompetent. You tried to steal my home, my savings, everything your father and I built over 45 years. You were going to warehouse me in the cheapest facility you could find and live off the proceeds. The lead officer stepped forward. Rebecca Chen, Thomas Morrison, you're under arrest. He began reading them their rights while his partner pulled out handcuffs. Rebecca lunged toward Margaret, desperation replacing calculation on her face. Mom, wait, we can work this out. I'm your daughter. Family doesn't do this to family. Margaret looked at her. This woman who wore her daughter's face, but whose soul had become unrecognizable. You're right, Rebecca. Family doesn't do this to family, but you stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth more to you as an incompetent old woman you could control than as the mother who sacrificed everything for you. As the officers led Rebecca and Tom toward the door in handcuffs, Rebecca twisted back one final time. I did this for us, for our future, for Emma. Margaret's voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. You did this for greed, and now you'll pay the price. The door closed behind them. The house fell silent except for the ticking of David's clock. Margaret stood in her living room, the unsigned power of attorney document still scattered on the coffee table, and felt the weight of 6 months lift from her shoulders. She'd won, but the victory tasted like ashes. The investigation that followed Margaret's call to the police uncovered a conspiracy far more extensive than even she had realized. Detective Sarah Ramirez, assigned to the case, discovered that Rebecca and Tom had been running a systematic scheme targeting other elderly clients through Tom's accounting firm. Over the past 3 years, they defrauded at least 6 other victims, using variations of the same playbook. Fabricate cognitive decline, isolate the victim, gain control of assets, and liquidate everything. The total amount stolen from all victims exceeded $2 million. The evidence Margaret had meticulously gathered became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The video footage, the recorded conversations, the detailed logs, all of it painted an undeniable picture of calculated, premeditated elder abuse. Rebecca's fellow lawyers from her firm testified that she'd consulted them about guardianship law months before approaching Margaret. Tom's business partner revealed that their accounting firm was on the verge of bankruptcy, providing the motive prosecutors needed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret attended every day, sitting in the courtroom with Linda beside her, watching as the daughter she'd raised was systematically exposed as a criminal. Rebecca's defense attorney tried to paint Margaret as a vindictive mother, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Rebecca was convicted of elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and disbarred permanently. Her law license, the achievement Margaret had sacrificed her dream lake house to fund, was revoked. Tom received 8 years for his role as the primary architect of the broader scheme targeting multiple victims. His accounting firm was dissolved, his professional license stripped. The courts ordered full restitution. Every penny Rebecca had stolen was returned to Margaret, plus damages and legal fees. Rebecca and Tom's assets, including their home, were seized and liquidated to compensate all the victims they'd defrauded. Patricia Hendricks from Elder Care Services lost her license after the investigation revealed she'd been complicit in multiple cases, accepting payment from Rebecca to provide false assessments. She faced her own criminal charges and a civil lawsuit from the families of other victims. Margaret's medical records were corrected, every false note removed, and Dr. Patterson wrote a formal letter for her file confirming she had never shown any signs of cognitive decline. The bank flagged Rebecca's name in their fraud prevention system. Every institution she'd manipulated now had documentation of her crimes. 8 months after the arrest, Margaret stood in her kitchen on a Sunday morning, the same spot where she'd made the decision to fight back. The house was quieter now. Emma visited occasionally, brought by Tom's sister Karen, who'd been granted custody after both parents were imprisoned. Margaret had established a trust fund for Emma, money that couldn't be touched by her parents, to ensure her granddaughter's education would be protected. The relationship was complicated. Emma was only 9, confused about why her parents were gone, angry at Margaret for taking them away. Karen was patient, explaining gently that Mommy and Daddy had made bad choices and hurt people. Margaret didn't push. She simply let Emma know she was always there, always ready with cookies and books and unconditional love whenever her granddaughter was ready. Margaret had also established the Chen Foundation for Elder Financial Abuse Prevention, using her story to raise awareness about a crime that affected thousands of elderly Americans every year. She spoke at community centers, libraries, and senior facilities, teaching people the warning signs, encouraging them to trust their instincts, reminding them that confusion and weakness were not the same thing. "My daughter saw my age and assumed I was helpless," she'd tell audiences. "But I survived poverty, discrimination, my husband's death, and 40 years in a demanding career. I wasn't about to be destroyed by greed disguised as concern." The foundation provided free legal consultation to elderly victims, helped them document abuse, and connected them with resources. In its first year, it assisted 43 victims in recovering over $3 million in stolen assets. Margaret had turned her pain into purpose, her betrayal into protection for others. She'd removed most of Rebecca's photos from her walls, unable to look at them without feeling the sting of betrayal. But she kept one. Rebecca, at 5 years old, gap-toothed and innocent, before greed had corrupted her soul. Sometimes Margaret would look at that photo and mourn the daughter who could have been, the relationship that should have existed. But she never regretted her choice to fight back. Some betrayals were too profound to forgive. Some wounds didn't heal just because time passed. And some people, even your own children, prove themselves unworthy of the sacrifices you'd made for them. Margaret had learned that blood didn't guarantee loyalty, that family was a verb, not just a noun. It was something you did, not just something you were born into. And she'd learned that sometimes the strongest act of love was protecting yourself from the people who should have protected you. She was 70 now, her hair completely silver, her face lined with the experiences of a full life. She lived alone, but wasn't lonely. She had her volunteer work, her foundation, her garden, and friends who'd proven their loyalty when it mattered most. Linda came for coffee every Tuesday. Her library colleagues organized monthly dinners. She'd built a chosen family to replace the biological one that had failed her. On Sunday mornings, she still set her table for family dinners, but now the faces around it were different. Karen and Emma when they visited, Linda and her husband, Patricia from the library. People who'd earned their place through genuine care rather than genetic connection. Margaret had survived. More than that, she'd thrived. She'd taken the worst betrayal imaginable and transformed it into strength, wisdom, and purpose. She'd proven that being a victim was a temporary state, not a permanent identity. And every morning when she looked in the mirror, she saw not the confused old woman Rebecca had tried to create, but the warrior she'd always been. Strong, capable, unbroken. Rebecca had tried to steal everything, but the one thing she could never take was Margaret's knowledge of her own worth, and that, ultimately, was what had saved her. Retry. Margaret's story is more than just a tale of betrayal and justice. It's a stark reminder that vulnerability and weakness are not the same thing, and that the people who underestimate the elderly make a dangerous, often catastrophic mistake. Our elders are not relics to be managed or obstacles to be maneuvered around. They are survivors who built the world we inherited. They lived through wars, economic depressions, social upheavals, and personal tragedies that would break many of us. They possess wisdom earned through decades of experience, resilience forged in fires we can barely imagine, and strength that doesn't diminish just because their hair turns gray. When Rebecca looked at her 68-year-old mother, she saw an easy target. She saw someone whose kindness could be exploited, whose trust could be weaponized, whose age could be used as evidence of incompetence. She made the fatal error of confusing Margaret's gentle nature with weakness, her generosity with gullibility. She forgot that the woman who raised her alone during military deployments, who built a career while caring for a dying husband, who survived loss after loss and emerged intact every time, was not someone who would simply surrender when threatened. This story also reveals a darker truth about the crime of elder financial abuse, one of the fastest growing yet least reported crimes in America. Every year, billions of dollars are stolen from elderly victims, and in the majority of cases, the perpetrators are family members, children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. People who should be protectors become predators. They see inheritance as entitlement rather than gift. They view their elderly relatives as obstacles standing between them and money they believe they deserve. But money obtained through betrayal carries a weight that no amount of wealth can offset. It comes wrapped in broken trust, destroyed relationships, and moral bankruptcy. Rebecca gained $68,000 and lost everything that actually mattered: her freedom, her career, her reputation, her relationship with her daughter, and her mother's love. The price she paid was infinitely higher than any amount she stole. Margaret's victory wasn't just personal. It was a statement that echoed far beyond her individual case. She proved that justice doesn't always require the loudest voice or the most aggressive confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is patience, intelligence, and meticulous preparation. She showed that the best defense against manipulation is often appearing to be exactly what your enemy expects while quietly building an inescapable trap. Most importantly, Margaret demonstrated that being a victim is a choice, not a destiny. Yes, she was victimized. Yes, terrible things were done to her by someone she loved and trusted. But she refused to accept that role permanently. She transformed from target to strategist, from prey to hunter, from victim to victor. She reclaimed her power not through emotional outbursts or desperate confrontations, but through cold calculation and unwavering determination. Her story is a warning to those who would exploit the vulnerable. Underestimate the elderly at your own peril. That grandmother you think is too confused to notice, that aging father you assume is too weak to fight back, may be far more aware and capable than you imagine. They may be watching, documenting, planning, and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. And when they do, the consequences will be devastating. To anyone listening who has experienced something similar or who suspects a loved one is being financially exploited, Margaret's story offers a roadmap. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Seek legal help from people the abuser doesn't know. Build your case quietly and thoroughly. Don't confront until you have irrefutable evidence. And remember that you are not helpless just because someone treats you that way. To the family members and caregivers who genuinely care for elderly loved ones with integrity and honor, thank you. Your work often goes unrecognized, your sacrifices unacknowledged. You are the opposite of Rebecca, the light that balances the darkness. Continue to protect, support, and respect the dignity of those who once protected you. Now we want to hear from you. What would you do if you discovered someone you trusted completely was systematically stealing from you and trying to have you declared incompetent? Would you confront them immediately, or would you take Margaret's approach and build your case quietly before striking? Have you or someone you know experienced elder financial abuse? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's facing a similar situation right now. If Margaret's journey from victim to victor moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about resilience, justice, and the strength of the human spirit. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, especially if you know elderly people who might be vulnerable to financial exploitation. Remember, being kind doesn't mean being weak. Being trusting doesn't mean being foolish, and being older doesn't mean being powerless. Margaret Chen proved that the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you've already won. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never underestimate the power of patience and preparation.